Good morning, Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1473, middle of 1473, the middle of the parentheses. But let's sum up what we've learned and then continue. So now the Rebbe Rashab has taken us back to the Parsa, and called the Parsa, the partition between Atzilus and Biy'a. And he explains, V'hine bichdei sha'ayin shel HaYesh yeh b'chinas kiruv el HaYesh. The ayin, the oir. Remember, we're talking about Atzilus is the creator. Obviously, he's beyond being a creator, but he does it through oir. Oir is God's expression. Think of it, divine expression. The expression, including the expression of creation, savos. It begins with an oir that is encompassed within the essence, like he said, which is not impacted by anything. It's just the koyach is galus, what he called the ayin of the yesh amiti. Then that oir travels, so to speak, and continues its journey until it actually manifests and engages with creation. So what is the process? How does it move from oir, that's just a seamless, immutable divine energy, into becoming an energy that relates to and engages with existence, what he calls kiruv el HaYesh? So he says that's through the Parsa. So the Parsa essentially is like a concealer, a partition that filters and distills and in some way allows that energy to become more commensurate to existence. Like he says, who moved and he gave the example of the nartik hashemesh, the sheath of the sun, which is like a membrane that through it the oir of the sun, the light of the sun is able to enter and ultimately illuminate the world. The way it is, and within the sun, it's not a mitzias yet. The nartik causes it to become a mitzias of oir. That for it to be a mitzias of oir, an oir that has a tangible identity, to be called mokir la'elam, is that's through the Parsa, between Atzilus and Biy'a. In Atzilus, it's still a state of Yechudei law. The Bittul of Yechudei law, because Atzilus, that's why Atzilus is called the world of unity. Shakol Bittul u'miyuchad be'erein sof ha'maitzil. Because everything there is nullified and miyuchad, completely consumed with the divine erein sof ha'maitzil, the divine energy from the emanator. Because in Atzilus, the air is like it's encompassed in its source. In the parentheses, he's going to explain what that means. And that's Atu Hashem levadecha, Havayahu Chinas Atzilus, but it's still in the state of levadecha, Hu levadehu, like it's kol batzmus. And now comes the parentheses before we return to Biy'a, the lower level of Yehuda Tata. So he says, and though Atzilus is actually Yitziv is Galus, Chutzlatz Museh. You just said Atzilus radiates the oir as it's encompassed in the source. So what is it? So, but we know that Atzilus is already a world that's outside of the source, so to speak. Yes, it's completely bottled to the source. So what does it mean that's chutzlatz museh while it's also kol batz museh? He says, so even that is in atzmuseh itself, there are two levels. And there's a level within the core that relates already to what is going to come afterwards. And he explains it with Atzilus the Klolos. Atzilus the Protis, which carries the same name. In microcosm, let's look at Atzilus the Klolos in macrocosm. That's the level of Erein Sof, this Pashtus Sa'er of Erein Sof before the Tzimtzum. Like we learned that there's two levels. There's the oir as it radiates to himself, and there's the oir that he is now Beis Mashamer Ba'asme B'chinas Eir HaShayach Le'emes. It's still radiating to himself, but it's already an oir that relates to existence. It's not outside of himself, it's within himself, how he is associating or thinking of or envisioning existence. And that's called Ispashta Sa'ir. Everything is an Atzmusei Adayin. It's all within himself. It's just two levels within the Atzmusei. And that's why it's called Atzilus B'chlolus, because in Atzmusei is the Eir HaShayach elements. Like I explained the difference between a teacher as he's thinking of an idea that he's relating to, and then he's thinking of the idea how he's going to teach that idea to someone else. It's still all within his core essence. He hasn't taught it yet. He hasn't even expressed it yet. He hasn't even defined it yet. But in his mind, he has, and within himself, he's already associating, envisioning it, and so on. And v'nikra zeh b'shem Atzilus, I'm just selecting certain lines that we read. Shehu b'chinas hizgalus chutz la'atzmusei. That's why it's called Atzilus. If it wasn't if it was all within the etzem mamish, Atzilus means imparting. It means transferring. It means to emanate. Like we spoke about from the Pasuk, the emanation from the Ruach, the Spirit HaMoshe, to the Skenim. Something is transmitting. This Galus Chutz La'atzmusei. So he explains that's L'tzeirach ha'ilmus. That means Chutz La'atzmusei. It's for the purpose of existence. So that's why it's not Etzem, it's not Etzem. He's not thinking about himself and his needs. He's thinking of what he's going to do with that energy as he's going to create existence. And that's where we stopped in the middle of the parentheses. He's going to continue now to explain this level, which will take us back to Atzilus the Proteus in microcosm, to understand how Atzilus in general is the state of Yichud De'ilah, that even though it is already an expression outward, but it's still relative to Biy'a, it is a state of within the core of the divine. Now, what needs a separate explanation, what's the difference in Atzilus the Klolos and Atzilus the Proteus? But briefly, I've explained the number of times. Atzilus the Klolos is completely within Elokus completely. There's no Tzimtzum yet. Atzilus the Proteus, there's already a Tzimtzum. After the Tzimtzum, you have still high states of the divine, but it is ultimately in a structure. But that really deserves its own discussion, which I'm not going to go into right now. It's not so relevant to our immediate conversation, even though it is relevant to the larger themes of Ayin Beis. I'm going to continue reading now from Ube'emes. It's around almost a little less than halfway down. The line that begins Adayin Kol B'Atzmusei, reading from Ube'emes. And the pages can be found, if you follow the text, at ayinbeis.com. Let's read this and we'll finish the parentheses, and then we'll continue from there. Ube'emes, and in truth, and remember, when the Rebbe Rashab says Ube'emes, he doesn't mean emes as versus not truth. He means and indeed. Be'emes is more like an indeed. Just Ube'emes, mishum shu b'chinas hispashta se'er, because this level, Atzilus the Klolos, is already hispashta se'er. Not etzema, not the as it is to himself, but it's his pasha within himself as he is envisioning or imagining the other. That's why we learned that level, even before the Tzimtzum, is the ultimate source of Mamala Kalam. Mamala Kalam, as we know, is the divine energy that enters and permeates, immanent energy that enters into existence. Mamala Kalam, not Sevav Kalam. The root of Sevav Kalam is an Etzemer, the Eir as it radiates to himself. So that will become ultimately Sevav Kalam, a type of transcendent energy. But Mamala Kalam, what's the root? Because God, within his own core essence, envisioned existence. Or, I don't say allocated, but it's a Spashus Eir. And that's that. So, Be'emes, because it's a Spashus, so in other words, you see from that it's not, even though it's Kol B'Atzmusei, but it does have features that are ultimately going to feed the Mamala Kalam of the Kav and Mamala Kalam that's going to enter into existence. Which is also coming to explain another thing. Malchus after Atzilus, we're already talking about Yehi, is already Koyach HaPoel B'Nifel. Before the Tzimtzum, it's not Koyach HaPoel B'Nifel, because there's no Nifel. There's no product yet. In the Etzem, he's allocating or envisioning the energy that's going to be the Koyach HaPoel B'Nifel. Mamala Kalam is Koyach HaPoel B'Nifel that we learned about. So he's saying now, so Be'emes, because it's this pashtus se'er, that's the root. V'shayach sham. And there you can apply the concept of sharshei ha'eris, the root of the eris, v'sharshei ha'kelim, and the root of the containers, the root. There's no eris and kelim before the tzimtzum. In Atzilus the Klolos. But there's a root, which is a subtle root. It means that we have some association. As I said, this whole purpose of all these levels is not that God needs them, it's because he wants to give us stepping stones and platforms that we can relate to. So now we have something that after the tzimtzum will become a malakalam, and eris and kelim, we have a place to locate them before the tzimtzum in God's consciousness. That's what he means by shoshei eris and shoshei kelim shehein, and they consist of the esses spheres agnuzas, the 10 hidden spheres in their highest level before the tzimtzum are essentially the root of eris and kelim. That's why they're called 10 spheres. But they're hidden spheres, like we learned earlier. Hidden means not just that it's hidden and not revealed; it's not yet formed. To the point he even called esses spheres agnuzas just shemis, just names. There are many ways to explain esses spheres agnuzas, and we discussed it at length when we learned it earlier. But suffice it to say, it's not 10 spheres. It's the root of the 10 spheres within the consciousness, divine consciousness before the tzimtzum. So, like we've talked about, a person is born, for example, every person ein adam b'loy bayis. Part of our etzem, the way we're wired, is that a person needs to have a home. To be complete, you need a home. Now, a person born, a little newborn child, doesn't think about having a home. Even when you're 10 years old, 20 years old, it can go by decades and decades, and then one day you say, you know what, time for me to buy a home, to build my own home. So that dormant atzmizdike need for a home is now starting to stimulate, starting to awaken. And then from the time you awaken that you want it till you actually start building it or start planning it, could also be another many years. We learned this earlier in volume 2, especially in Tzadik Dalet, the Hemshech Tzadik Dalet. If you remember, there was the whole process where he talked about consideration, deliberation, and determination, all the 3 levels, where there's the skama, then there's finally the achlota, and there's the shakavitaria. So there's a process for all these things. So the same thing, Havyochel, by the Eibishter before the Tzimtzum, there's the consciousness, divine consciousness, just Gili Elikus, the idea of Gili, expression. Then within that expression, there's Kaidem Alei Saratzin, if you remember, before it arises in his desire to create. And then there's the desire to create, and then he begins to envision what the creation is going to look like. All this is before the Tzimtzum. So you see here a bunch of levels. Here he's talking generally 2 levels. The Etzemer and the Spashtus. So the Esses Spheres Agnuzis is already the envisioning, at least the somewhat envisioning the structure of the 10 spheres, but it's not 10 spheres yet. They'll become 10 spheres after the Tzimtzum, and ultimately in Atzilus, Esses Spheres Hagluyas, the revealed 10 spheres. So to go back to the point here, that because it's Spashtus, that's why you can speak about it as being a source for Mamalakalanen, and the sherish and a root for the and a root of Eris and Sharshei Kelim, a root of containers, which is the 10 hidden spheres. All this is Atzilus the Klolos. U'kamoshon is bar leil, as was explained or discussed earlier. Now he's going to come back to Atzilus the Protis. Remember, all this was coming to explain how can we say that Atzilus is Yichudei Law and encompassed in the core when Atzilus is Yitzia, is already a world that has emanated. It's already expressed. It's a world that is already been imparted. Atzalti, it's been imparted. So he explained from Atzilus the Klolos. Now let's bring it back to Atzilus the Protis. Same as with the world of Atzilus, he means here the microcosm. Sheneda, it's known, because it's known, the Inyan Atzilus b'chunis mamutza li is b'chunis gili ein sof, b'elam. Atzilus serves the purpose of being an interface of gili ein sof b'elam. We've learned this earlier at length, that Atzilus is on one hand, it's godliness, on the other hand, it's a godliness within structure. You have Chochma, Binah, Das. One of the ways he explained it was through Atzilus. We know God through Atzilus. and we could feel God through emotions, because Atzilus is divine intellect and divine emotions. So then human intellect and human emotions can associate with the divine intellect and emotions. That in turn introduces us to godliness. If there was no Atzilus, the leap from a divine that's beyond these faculties and attributes to a world that has faculties and attributes would be too big. So Atzilus serves like a platform, an interface platform between the two, and also mamutza liyas, also mamutza to create existence. So when you say Yehi Oyer, Yehi Rakia, God used his Chochma, his Binah, his Das, his Keser, his Gvura to create the world, we also have an interface. It's divine attributes on one hand, it's divine, but it's attributes. So we see it from this, Atzilus serves this dual purpose. Therefore, that's why it's going to that's going to lead us to understand that Atzilus on one hand is Yitzia L'chutz, it's already associating with existence, but it's divine. It's fundamentally a divine revelation, which is why it's called Kol Batzmuse. So, but it is now after the Tzimtzum, we're talking Atzilus, a microcosm. That's what it says in Zayad, that Atzilus is there to guide. Manhig, Lanoga is to rule, to guide, to govern. Govern is the best word. Ulanoda, and Nada from the word light, illuminate. Bahun Alman, through that, it governs and illuminates the worlds. Ukamation is Barlil, as we learned earlier. Why can Atzilus do this? Because Atzilus is not a pure creation. If Atzilus was also a creation, then it's already so-called a product. Atzilus is really a revelation of the Ein Sof, of the divine infinite light, of the Maitzil, of the emanator. So it is an emanation, but it's an emanation of the emanator. And that's what it's still, but it's the Gile'er that relates to existence. So there's the Gile'er as relates to himself. That's the Etzem Eir la'atzmei. But within the Etzem, there's also the Gile'er Shaykh le'elamus. And that's why Atzilus is ultimately the interface. Of a Makom Mokim, so even though it's Shaykh le'elamus, but just like it is with Atzilus the Klolos, that it's still part of the divine consciousness, here too, Makom Mokim ein ze b'chinas yitzia mamish chutz la'atzmusei. You can't say that it's exited, it's completely removed or outside of atzmusei, meaning the core of Elikus. Kima kolu adayim b'chinas atzmusei ein sof. Atzilus still remains an extension of Ein Sof. Now, just to give an example, when let's say a king wants his people to build him a structure. Okay, so he sends his own emissary, his loyal assistant, his loyal ambassador, and says, "I want you to oversee this. Make sure it's done exactly to perfection, to my guidelines." And he sends the ambassador over to watch, to oversee. Now, of course, the ambassador may not be the actual builder. They hire contractors and they hire workers. But the ambassador is there to protect the interests and make sure it's exactly aligned with the way the king wants it. So is the ambassador chutz le'etzem or part of the etzem? So on one hand, you could say he's chutz because he's the one, he's going to the place and he's involved and engaged, but he's not really a builder, and he's definitely not the building itself. On the other hand, he is like representing the king, shluchah shalom kamesei, so he's really in the etzem because it's just the king messenger that has only one role, to make sure it's done exactly as the king wants it. Biy'a is already the building of the structure itself. But Atzilus is that in between. On one hand, it's already relating to existence, but it's still a divine emanation. And that's what he means when he says, however, in Atzmusei itself, it's not about the light that shines to himself and relates more to the divine. It's the divine as it relates to creating the world, and that the revelation should be commensurate to the worlds. which is essentially what he said before, Gilead and Sub Elam, so it's both to create and also to measure it properly. Because why does the king have to send a messenger? Why can't the messenger just stay in the king's palace? Because he has to be there, he has to oversee it, he has to see what's being built. Obviously, this doesn't apply Lamaila because Lamaila there's no traveling, it's all, but it's stages of spiritual engagement with existence. And that's what Atzilus is, that in-between place. So it has both aspects. And now he concludes the parentheses with a punchline, why he came to parentheses. And that's why we could say in Atzilus, what kind of bittul is there? It's the bittul of the ambassador, of the shliach. It's not the bittul of the builders or of the structure itself. It's the bittul of the Yichudei Lo, Shakula Kamei Kalo, like we learned before, Kaloi. Kalo. Everything is completely nullified. All of this ambassador's role is, the role of this Oyer, all it is a Gilead of Atzilus. But it's a Gilead of Atzilus relating to existence. So in a sense, what you can say is like this. Before the Tzimtzum and Atzilus, the Klolos, you have Gilead Elikus, Gilead Etzem, the higher level. You have Hispashus in the godly Etzem. It's not even sending the ambassador out yet. It's God in his palace. He's envisioning what the structure is going to look like. Then he actually sends a shliach. That would be Atzilus the Proteus, that actually enters into Seder Shtalshlus, but its role is to represent the Elikus. That's why it's a Yichudei Lo. It's still representing all the Elikus. And now, after the parentheses, we're going to speak about Bittul HaYesh, Yichud Tata, the Yichud in existence itself. So that would be how I would explain it with this example that helps place everything in its particular location. But I will stop here for questions. But we're going to read next is going to go back to Biy'a, the lower level of Yichud, which we haven't yet gotten to yet. Any questions?
In this context, is Atzilus considered a shoresh or a ha'ara of the or both?
Maybe you could explain what that means in English, and I could answer. I don't know what those words mean.
Okay, well,
your mind.
All right.
I mean, it's nice words, but tell me what you mean by those words.
Okay. Well, we got here in the context of understanding whether our avoda touches godliness, touches God, affects him, or if there's any shinui or hispilus. And of course, ba'atzmus, we say essentially the answer is no, but you also mentioned in some sense it does. It's a little bit of a paradox. But in any case, in the most practical sense that we can understand it, at the lowest level, it's a hara of a hara. It's an extension, a reflection of a reflection. It's not really the source of the light.
Wait, you're talking about avoda now? You're talking about creation process.
Avoda. And whether our avoda affects.
Okay, so he's not talking about avoda here. He's talking here about creation process.
Well, okay, but I get it. I hear you loud and clear. But at the same time, we got here in the context of trying to understand.
Yeah, we did, but I'm saying your question is on what we got here, or we're talking about what we just learned now? Because if you speak about avoda, that's another conversation. I'm happy to talk about it, but he didn't talk about that here right now.
Well, but this is the source of, well, okay. I guess my question is, are we, to the extent we can interact with Atzilus, and we talked about the highest our avoda can touch is malchus of Atzilus.
You want to talk about avoda, not creation? Is that what you want to address?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so then I would say let's wait, because right now we're not learning about avoda. We're learning about Isavus and the Gilui and the two levels. I don't want to confuse the two. Okay. We can talk about that either later in this class after we finish about Biy'a, or I'm happy to talk about it, but I just don't want to conflate the two. This is not a question of what we learn right now. It's more the whole discussion about avoda and so on.
Yeah, true. Okay, I'll wait. Thank you.
I just hope you can concentrate what we're learning here, because right now he's talking very specifically about the two levels that he was talking about, Yichudei Lo, Yichudei Tata, in corresponding to the two levels of Oyer. So Atzilus, we've established, is Yichudei Lo, the higher level of Bittul. And now he's going to go to the lower level of Biy'a. Continuing reading inside, but Biy'a, yesh. Now we've entered the world of yesh. Yesh meaning an independent consciousness. We're not talking about the divine consciousness of Atzilus. Yes, it's a divine consciousness that relates to existence. Now we're talking about the yesh itself, the existence itself. There, the Gilead Ein Sof that radiates in Atzilus does not shine. Now, what he means by that, it doesn't mean it doesn't shine at all. It's just not that level, and it's not. Its main focus here is existence. Now we're talking about the art, not the artist. Atzilus is also part of the structure, but the focus there is the artist within the art. And here we're talking about the art itself, the creation itself. And where's the moked of this isavus? And the source of this isavus, like we learned on the top of the page, is the Parsa. You need the Parsa to weaken and diffuse and limit and be the partition that is like the curtain that limits the flow of Atzilus to be able to create an independent consciousness, an independent entity called Biy'a. So what's the Moked Isavus? From Bechinas Ha'ores Malchus Atzilus, it's Malchus of Atzilus as it shebekas as Hamosach va'Parsa that has pierced the curtain and the partition. Remember, Mosach and Parsa are generally at the same level, but they could be broken into two. He's using both terms. Before he just used Parsa. Why? I can't answer that immediately. Why? Maybe just adding the second dimension. But Mosach and Parsa essentially in Hebrew and in Aramaic, the idea of a partition, a curtain. Sheben Atzilus Biy'a. So now that's how this, because now you're talking about a yesh. And like he said, to be able to be the ayin of the yesh, b'chinas kiruv, koyach hapoel beniful, to enter into existence, that's the parsa. So Malchus of Atzilus is piercing. It's a light that's shining through the curtain, through the partition between Atzilus and Biy'a. The ein melech b'lo yam. So now it connects Malchus as melech. Ein melech b'lo yam. A king cannot be a king without a nation. Lias isavus nivroim nefrodim. And we know am from the word emamus, that they're separate. An am, a nation of a king, is not his children. It has to be separate entities. Separate entities implies a yesh. Atzilus can be is not a Atzilus itself is all elikus. So here you have a yesh, the yesh of Biy'a, the Malchus of Atzilus is now a king of the am of Biy'a, the Nivroim Nifrodim. And it's the Parsa that creates the ability for there to be Nifrodim, something separate. In Atzilus, you never say the word Nifrad. He said clearly, Elam ha'achdus. It's unity. All you feel is unity, divine unity, Shakol Botlu Miyuchad Be'erein Sof HaMaitzil, like you said on the top of the page. Here, you're talking about Alma de Pruda, a world that's already separate. Now, separate doesn't mean against, defying, but it means it's a separate entity. Another consciousness has emerged. In macrocosm, this is Biy'a the Chlolos of Adam Kadmon, just to fill in that point if you're wondering. But we're talking here in microcosm, this is the Atzilus to Biy'a leap of the Parsa, which was a very prominent theme back in volume 2 when he asked the question. It's one thing that Atzilus should be reconnected to the divine source, but Biy'a is after the Parsa. How can you have, following the Parsa, an experience of pre-Parsa consciousness? Or in different words, after the Tzimtzum, how can we have pre-Tzimtzum consciousness? So that's a big part of the transformation of the Tzimtzum and so on. Very much of what we're discussing now. We'll get back to that when need be, because that's ultimately part of this whole theme. But specifically, what he's saying now, we're carrying, the Oyer is now traveling from the Oyer of Yechudei Elah in Atzilus through the Parsa, Malchus the Atzilus through the Parsa, into Biy'a, where there's now a Yesh and Nefrodim. And there's still a Yichud. We'll soon get to Yichud Tata. But first we have to explain the reality. Now we're talking about an independent consciousness. Which means that due to this Isavus, the Isavas causes is a Yeshem Mitzias. So in other words, the very creation we now can understand how can there be a creation of something that's not aware and conscious only of the divine? How is it possible that Biy'a should not be like Atzilus? The answer is the Parsa, the concealment. That is what is the power of creation, is to create something, say, Bereshis bara Elokim, which is Tzimtzum, Din Tzimtzum and Parsa, that conceals, and that's why there can now be another consciousness, because the predominant, or the all prevailing, I should say, divine consciousness has been concealed to some extent. That's what Hisavas does. And that process is the steps of Malchus Atzilus through the Parsa, creating existence of Biy'a, the Nifrodim. But it doesn't stop. Now there is going to be Avodah. And Avodah does change things. That would be left on its own. So Biy'a is HaYesh U'Mitzias. Now comes the next step. Rak, who bottle, medaite v'ritzene. So since but however, what happens next is that Biy'a is bottle medaite v'ritzene at its own volition and its own initiative and its own desire. It's bottle. Atzilus is bottle b'meila. Because all it is an extension on Netzal v'Yetzel min HaRuach. All it is an emanation of the divine source. Here we have a separate consciousness, but this separate consciousness, medaitu ritzene, is bottled to Hashem. V'hu in Kabbalas el Malchus Shamayim. That's the idea of Kabbalas el, when we accept the yoke of heaven, which means it's a way that we accept the authority and we're accountable to the Creator. That's an effort that the yesh is mevatl, nullifies itself. It itself on its own is an entity of its own, a separate consciousness. But it chooses to nullify itself, to sublimate itself. The daitiv v'ritzeni repeats again, at its own volition, at its own choice and desire to be bottled. The ein zeh. That's not like the Bittul of Yechudei Allah of Atzilus. That's not like the nullification, the sublimation, or the complete absorption, if you wish, the dissolving, the being dissolved like in the Yechudei Allah. That is automatic, natural. The mitzad the Gila of Ein Sof and Atzilus is bottled. That's why the bittul of Yechudei law is a true bittul. Shu klom mamish keziv hashemesh b'shemesh. It's completely nullified, like the light of the sun within the sun. Aval Yechudei tata, but the lower bittul in Biy'a, who she'ena bottle b'meila. It's not automatic. Ki'im shemavat lesatzme. This is the effort of that creation nullifying itself. Aideha is bonus. Through the contemplation, Sha'ayin Eliki hu amahava eseh. When it contemplates that who has created me is the Ayin Eliki that has come through the Parsa. So that contemplation leads Harihu Botlel Ayin Eliki. When he contemplates, then he realizes and comes to the awareness to be bottled, to be nullified in the presence of the Ayin Eliki, the divine higher state that's higher than the yesh. Bittul, that's the method, that's how he gets to the bittul, through an effort. And the level of bittul is not bittul amiti. A bittul who begins bittul HaYesh levad. It's only a bittul of the yesh. It's not a total nullification as if it doesn't exist. Like he said before, hu levadehu, total nothingness except godliness. Here is bittul HaYesh, the agam shabatul, even though he is indeed sublimated, even though he is indeed completely subjugated to the source, he's not eliminated his existence. He's still in the state of a yesh, he's still in the state of an entity. There's an entity that's bottled. It's not complete sublimation or complete subjugation or complete nullification, like we learned earlier. Let me read a few more lines and then I'll stop again for questions. The kol zeh, and what distinguishes, why is one this higher state of consciousness, of divine kind, and this is a lower state? It goes back to the reason. The kol zeh mipnei she'ha'ara ha'lekis. All this is due to the fact that the divine reflection, hainu b'chinas ha'ayin shala yesh, the ayin of the yesh hanivra, of the yesh below, shaboy Parsa, that came through the Parsa, through the partition, b'chinas galus lahaves, in a state of revelation to create, hu b'chinas simtzum v'helam ha'er. All this is due to the fact that it's in a diminished and a concealed state. And that's the ha'ara of ha'ara, not just the oir of elikus, which we learned earlier can be a very high level. Atzilus is oir, and even higher than Atzilus, the klolus, etzem oir, but those are all very high levels. Even Ispashta says, Yechud Elah. Now we're talking about a ha'ara of ha'ara, as he referred to earlier, that is involved in the creation process. Because it comes through a tzimtzum and a helam, which is through the Parsa, that conceals that level, that creates the yesh. So the bittul is also a bittul commensurate to the yesh, not a bittul of the higher order and the higher level of Yichud Elah of Atzilus. Okay. Al-Kain, the Sava Mizan Evroyim. And because of this concealment, that's why through it was created, the creatures were created, B'chinas yesh, in a state of yesh, meaning they have substance, they have an independent consciousness. And even their bittul is also in a state of bittul, only bittul yesh. It means it's an entity, but it's batul. Go back to my example. The ambassador of the king is batul b'mitzias. Well, he has only one role. He's just representing the king. The builders and the structure itself, their job is to be in existence. Their job is to work hard and to build. But they're also building it and they're aligned to what the king wants. They're following the orders, but they are a yesh that's following. Whereas the ambassador, the shliach, like I explained, like Atzilus, is not a yesh. It's elikus as it relates to existence. And then existence is aligned with the creator, which is the bittul yesh of Biy'a. And that's the distinction between Yichud Elah and Yichud Tata. We have not yet come back to the fact that they're joined together, Kel Deus Havaya, who's Sevel and contains both of them, and they're really, really one level, which we'll get to. Just want to make that clear. Right now, he's still talking about them as two separate states. And there's more to say on this matter before he goes back. The next page, he'll go back to how they join together, which ultimately is the ultimate union of these two levels of Yichud itself. But we're not there yet. So let me stop here for any questions. Okay. Okay, so the next little section I see is also, most of what we learn now is the Rebbe Rashab's language. It's based on the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, page 381, if you want to do comparison, which we'll get to when we learn that. But right now, it's been a big elaboration. Most of this is the Rebbe Rashab, but it's based on the page 381 in Mittler Rebbe. The next little section is back to the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, where he's going to explain something really interesting. I mean, interesting to me at least, because this brings us back to the end of volume 2, where he spoke these two levels of ayin, the ayin of the yesh amiti and the ayin of the yesh anivra. There's a very central theme at the end of volume 2. I don't know if any of you remember that long discussion. The Maimarim of Ayin Vav, essentially the end of volume 2, where he spoke that there's two levels of ayin, and he gave, I think, 5 or 6 explanations what they are. So here, the Mittler Rebbe talks about it. The Rebbe Rashab is going to quote. Some of this is direct quotes. So the next little section is to explain how the two levels of ayin that we just discussed, which here they're discussed right now as the ayin of the Yesha Amiti, is the higher level of Etzem Ha'er, and the ayin of Yesha Nivri is the Ispashtus Ha'er. or that's in the way it is before the Tzimtzum, or the difference in Atzilus and Biy'a. The ha'ara, the oir, as it is in Atzilus, there it's yichudei law. It's like it's encompassed in the etzem. Shaykh al-elamis, but it's encompassed in the etzem. And then there's the ha'ara, the oir, as it manifests koyach hapel benifel and relates to creation, not in Atzilus, in Biy'a. And that ayin, for it to go into Biy'a, requires the Parsa, like he said, to be kiruv el HaYesh. So essentially, an oir that's not kiruv el HaYesh is somewhat removed. And there's the oir that's kiruv el HaYesh and relates to existence. That's how we've been learning it. He's now going to explain that these two levels of ayin are many levels in the Atzilus. That's the next little section here, which, why I say it's interesting, not just interesting, it's very powerful because he's tying together the interface on all levels here. And you'll soon see he also connects it to Kutcha Bricha V'Shchinta. If you remember Yichud, Yichud is also the connection of Kutcha Bricha V'Shchinta, which he discussed earlier on page 1439, also had many interpretations. Kutcha Bricha and Shchina was on higher levels and lower levels. He spoke about it, I think, also 3-4 different ways. So he's now tying all together that the two levels of Yichud we're talking about can be found throughout Atzilus, not just Atzilus and Biy'a, also in higher levels. That's going to be the next little section here. That's a short intro for that section. So let's learn it inside. So he says like this now. U'kamoy kain, like we just discussed, that there's two levels of Yichudei Lo, Yichudei Tata. The two levels we spoke about. Kamoy kain, min ha'maitzil el ha'natzolim yesh gam ken beis b'chinas ayin hanal. From the emanator to the emanations, meaning not Biy'a, but now we were talking about Atzilus and Biy'a. From the emanator to the emanations, there's also two levels of ayin. Hanal. And where do we? And how does that play itself out here? Shari v'chochma ma'ayin timotz. Chochma v'Atzilus, we say about it, Chochma ma'ayin. Chochma comes from ayin, the ayin of Keser. So till now we were talking about the ayin, the two levels of ayin, Atzilus and Biy'a. Says the ayin of Keser, Chochma ayin timotz shenimtzas b'bchinas yesh ma'ayin de Keser. Chochma itself is also subtly, relatively speaking, again, compared to Keser, like Yesh. Chochma is like the Yesh that comes from the ayin of Keser. Which would mean that Chochma now is like the ayin that's already entering into existence. And Keser, ubchinas, ayin de Keser. And what is the ayin of Keser? What level is that? Kamoishu ubchinas ha-Keser, the way it is in the level of Keser, ubchinas ayin shel yesh amiti. That's like the ayin of the yesh amiti, like we spoke before about the ayin that is completely nullified. Kula kamek kalachash. So now he's lifting up this discussion to a higher level. That Atzilus, or Chochma Atzilus, compared to Keser, is like Biy'a compared to Atzilus. It doesn't say what I just said explicitly. I'm just saying it to just give a little context. Not quite the same. But relatively speaking, what now is the higher level of ayin? That's the ayin of Keser, which is the ayin of the Yesh Amiti. For who b'chinas ha-bittul v'yichudei Lo? And Keser, the ayin of Keser, is a bittul of the higher level of unity, the kala mamish. That's as if it doesn't, kala mamish, completely nullified. U'kamaymer, like the statement from Zoyar, Keser Elyon, that Keser Elyon, the supernal crown, or Keser, afal gav the ihu oir, even though it's a level of oir and gilui, because it's a state of revelation, uchamhu kodem ilis ha'ilis. It's darkened and like black compared to the cause of all causes. Ilis ha'ilis, the cause of causes. So everything relative. We learned this as well earlier. So in other words, even though Keser itself is a gilui, but compared to higher, ukamhu, so it's ayin. It's a state of total bittul. So now Yichudei Lo is applying now to Keser. Mibchinas shachrus or bittul betachlis. Shachrus is darkness. Utter darkness and utter nullification. And that's the way Keser is compared to Ayin of the Yesh Amiti. Like we said before, the Oyer that's completely bottled within the sun to the core. And what about the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, so to speak? And the way Keser becomes a source for Chochma, looking down, not Yesh HaNivra, Yesh HaNetzal. It becomes the Ayin of the Yesh HaNetzal, the entity called the emanation, which is Atzilus. So we've talked now, he's now applying these two levels on a higher state. Before, he was saying that Atzilus is the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. And that's why Atzilus Yichudei Elah. And then the Ayin comes down through the Parsa into Biy'a. Now he's saying these two levels on a higher level is Keser and Chochma, or Keser and Atzilus. And interestingly, who gam ken al yedei Parsa. So how's that leap happen? Just like we said earlier, what causes that shift? So there's a Parsa between Keser and Atzilus too. Just like there's a Parsa between Atzilus and Biy'a. Who gam ken al yedei Parsa sheyesh bein haKeser leChochma. There's a membrane between Keser and Chochma. Top of page 1474. U'kamoshin is bodily ill. As was discussed at length, stressed earlier in middle of volume 2. I'll give you the page when I open up that volume. I don't have it right in front of me. We discussed there, he discussed there that there are membranes, there are partitions, all the way up to the highest levels. Look at the human body, as he explains there. There's a diaphragm, there's a throat, there are membranes in the brain. There are many partitions in the structure. Atzilus to Biy'a is one primary partition, but there's also a partition between Keser and Chochma, and that partition also diffuses between the Yichudei Elah, or what he's calling here the higher level of Ayin of Yesh Amiti of Keser, and then the Ayin, how it becomes the Ayin of the Yesh HaNetzal of Atzilus. So there you have the same two levels on a higher state. So just again intensifies the interface experience. The Chain, yet another one, is this. Binah la Midos. In Atzilus itself, between Binah and the Midos, which is Chagas Nehi or Chagas Nehim, that between Binah and the emotions that below it, Yesh Gam Kim Parsa. Is yet another partition. Shaydezeh mi Bada Ela. Through that comes Mi. Mi is the level of Binah. Bada Ela is 36, is 6 times 6 emotions, as we learned earlier. So between Binah, Mi, you say, Su Marim Menechem, raise your eyes to have Mi. Who created all of these? All of what? The emotions are created from Mi of Binah. So that's the level of a Parsa between Binah and the Midos. Sheyesh b'zeh gam ken beis b'chinas ayin anal. And here too, there are two levels of ayin. The ayin of the higher yesh, in other words, the ayin that's bottled to its source, and the ayin as it comes downward to the next lower level that goes through the parsa to relate to the lower level and relate to it. So you see now already
lower level, right?
What's that? You see now three different explanations on different levels. We see two levels of ayin. You have Atzilus to Biy'a, you have from Keser to Chochma, and now from Binah to Midos.
So Binah to Midos is lower than Keser to Chochma, right?
I would think so. Yeah. Binah is lower than Chochma, so it's lower than Chochma, yeah. I'll stop here if anybody wants to ask anything. He's still going to bring a few more levels in here to show how these two levels of Yichudei Elah, Yichudei Atah are so fundamental because they're on all the levels of Ishtalshlus, essentially.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Now remember, one second. Remember, this isn't just technicalities. The reason the Rebbe Rashab is saying this is because in Avodah, each of these two levels of ayin is a different level of Avodah. So it's really about a person who's taken this journey. And for most of us, the Bittul would be Bittul HaYesh, from just simply not following your animal soul's desires and somewhat directing yourself toward godliness. And a Bittul of Yichud Elah would be when you're completely consumed with the divine, let's say on Yom Kippur, or certain high points in a person's life. But the Rebbe Rashab in his thoroughness is explaining this on all levels, because people on this journey are different levels of states of Aveda. Everybody has their particular state. So that's what all these levels refer to, and that really needs explanation. What is the application for each one of us of these different levels? That's another discussion which we'll have, but right now I'm not going to go there. I'm just making that emphasis and point. Okay, go on. Yes, please.
Sorry, thank you. I guess my question is, so in the ultimate future, since we have, these are obviously extremely high states of consciousness that we are limited by because of our own ability to conceive of this kind of stuff. And it's all goes up. I mean, it's infinite, right? I mean, this is just like the highest levels we're getting to here is what the great sages and masters understand that the human mind is able to perceive. In the ultimate future, are we going to be able to just keep going higher, like become infinite? That's what I'm saying.
The answer is yes. And but it doesn't, you don't have to wait for the future. It begins now. Each of us in our own way can reach levels, obviously for each person relative to their place. When we go through Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, this whole season, that's exactly what the journey is meant to be, to reach toward the infinite, and each person in their capacity. Like we say in V'ahavta b'chol levavcha b'chol nafshecha b'chol maidecha, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, all of you. So for each of us, it's a journey. What we have to do is personalize and customize this for our particular journey. That's why you need a mashpia, where you could discuss more detail how this fits into your framework. In other words, it's taking this idea and then applying it to your life where you are at. So the journey is right now. And those that really experience these days, especially Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur of all days, is the journey from Nefesh to Yechida, the 5 levels of the soul. Literally what we're discussing here. Because Yechida is, of course, the highest level, but then there's Nefesh, is Asiya, Ruach is Biy'a, as Yitzira, Neshama is Biy'a, Chai is Atzilus, Yechida is Keser. Or you could say the 2 levels of Chai, Yechida in Keser itself. And then Chabad Chagas Nihi is Neshama, Ruach, and Nefesh. I mean, however you explain it. So the journey of what we're doing right now, and I just mentioned Yom Kippur journey, is really finding within yourself these states. And I assure you that if you do it right and you find the right person that can help you, you can find in your life all these 5 levels that I just mentioned. Here he's talking 2 levels, but 2 levels on different dimensions. And you can find it within yourself. It just requires a little simas lev attention and focus and concentration and so on. But the future is a whole other story, because then many things we will be redeemed from our animal souls in many ways, and many of the negative stuff that exists today will be eliminated. So you can focus completely just on climbing the mountain higher and higher toward the infinite. In other words, a battle from good to better instead of between bad and good.
Thank you. I just have to find a mashpia.
Yeah. Okay, so I think I'll stop here, because the next section is going to say that even more generally, these 2 levels of Bittul of Ayin is also the Kav, and even higher, and even before the Tzimtzum. So he's going to explain Yichud Elah, Yichud Tata on all the levels. He's already essentially alluded to it when we talked about Atzilus the Klolos before the Tzimtzum. But he's going to spell it out at the end of this paragraph. But I think I'll stop here, just a lot to absorb. I don't want to rush things here. So we're line 2 of 1474. I'll stop here. But are there any other questions, any further questions? So what we do see here, I'll just add one more thing before we sign off. That he has, even though we've been talking about the track of Isavos creation, he has already suggested here that there is some avodah, because he said Kabbalah soil in Biy'a, it's coming through avodah, and the Bittul HaYesh, and very much the very fact that we're contemplating. He said the words Izbananus, Sha'ayin Eliki, that's already not a creation process. That's already an effort process, an avodah process. So we are definitely going to get back to the idea of what our avodah is, because at the end of the day, God creates the existence, Atzilus, Biy'a, but it's up to us to be miyached elikus. The yichud does not happen automatically. Even though in Atzilus there's an automatic yichud, because that's what Atzilus is. But when it comes to us, down below in Biy'a, we need to be miyached elikus, both yichud elah, yichud aton. That's when we say Shema and Baruch Shem. That's our avodah of our cognizance, our awareness, and our integration of these levels of unity that ultimately will lead to V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha in transforming also the animal soul to love God, to be the shemen, the oil that fuels the divine soul and divine light and the divine reality and divine love. So that's the overall context. So we will get to that. Unfortunately, the Rebbe Rashab himself is probably not going to lead us on this entire journey, because we're going to have to go back to the Mittler Rebbe's Maimah for that. A lot of what I just said. But I still believe that a lot of what the Rebbe Rashab says is really preparing us. And then when we come to the end of it, we'll go to the Mittler Rebbe's Maimah, which I've looked at quite in depth now. And I do see the seamless flow is quite amazing. It's not like a very big leap. It's almost like a setup. I mentioned that already. Not that the Rebbe Rashab, I'm sure he wanted to finish the Hemshech, but he didn't leave us hanging. You'll see, it pretty much flows pretty smoothly from where he concludes here in a few pages into the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, and going back even to Ner Mitzvah, and tying together a lot of things. And I'm very, as I said, very confident that we will have a pretty good picture of what Ayin Beis would have looked like had the Rebbe Rashab concluded. Obviously, with a big qualification that I don't know what the Rebbe Rashab would have added to it all. I'm sure he may have added and would have added a lot. But to say that it's completely lost and like things are just not tied up and just finished, it's not that case, because the Mittler Rebbe does elaborate quite at length about many of the themes. And I think when we can combine the Rebbe Rashab's elaboration and with the Mittler Rebbe's substance, well, together we'll be able to figure out a lot. And we'll see how much, and we'll see if what remains still unclear. And that's all exciting part of the next legs of this journey. But we shall get there as we go, as we move along. So I am stopping here at the top of page 1472.
Can I ask you a quick question?
I haven't stopped the recording. Is the question on what we just discussed, or it's outside of the
Yes.
recording? I mean,
No, it's on what we just discussed.
Okay, so then I'll leave the record. Go ahead.
So, not to sound like a broken record or beat a dead horse, but I want to return to the question I asked before. I asked the question of whether Atzilus was a reflection of core godly light, or a shorish or source itself, because it's null. It is kulo kedusha. It's all elikus. It's complete. But the question, and you asked me, are you talking about in the creation process, or are you talking about in our avodah? And so that threw me a little bit. But
because you started speaking avodah terms, so I thought you were talking about avodah, not creation.
I understand. I understand. You're
But
right.
if you want to talk creation, I can talk very directly, because that is what we're discussing here. Avodah deserves its own conversation.
Okay, so to me, I'm not sure I understand why it should be different. I mean, the elikus and the hishtalshelus is structured the way it is, and for that matter, the creation.
Well, hold on. I need to answer that very quickly and immediately, because firstly, it's two separate things. There's a creation of the building, and then what the people who come into this world, the human beings, do to this creation. It's completely two different tracks entirely. And more than that, the Rebbe Rashab made it very clear it's two different tracks in his parentheses on page 1471, where he very much separated and said this is Isavos and this is avodah. So it's very two separate things. In the overall scheme of Ayin Beis, the whole bigger theme, of course, they all come together because God created the world for us to come and do avodah in the world. That's obvious.
Right.
But in the discussion, he made it very clear there's two separate things when you talk about shinui and hispilus. So that's, to me, very clear. But go ahead. If you have a specific question, I'm happy to answer.
Okay. Well, let me ask a question. And you say I'm mixing these tracks, then fine, that's your answer. Okay, we understand the Eibishter is creating the world anew every moment. So this creation process is not like historical matter. It is, but it's also immediate. It's happening right now. And then
Correct.
relative to our avoida, like you just responded to Robin's question, that essentially we can touch these levels in our avoida. But the question becomes, how do we get there, and what are we connecting with, if you will, or if we can reach these levels, as you said, like in Yom Kippur, the Yechida of the neshama connecting at the highest levels, ideally with proper Gavana davening, then there is a direct connection. Now, the question was whether you're going to get, whether there's a shinui or hispilus. Okay, that's maybe.
So what's your
secondary,
question? I'm not understanding the question. Are you asking me, can we do through avodah reach levels? The answer is, of course you can.
No, I understand we can, but I guess what I'm asking is, what am I asking?
Now think about it. It's all right. We're not running anywhere. It's fine.
Yeah, I guess I need to rethink my question so I can frame it properly. And the idea
It's
that
fine.
these
It's all right.
structures-
As I said, we're all patient, and I'm patient. I don't need to force anything. It'll come. The topic you'll think about. It's fine. We're in it. The only thing I can say is this: for practical purposes, Bittul HaYesh and Bittul Mitzias, or Yichud Tato, Yichud Allah, are two things, two levels that each of us in our own relative way can work at. And I gave examples for it. Bittul HaYesh would be more, when you are dealing with your daily routines and life.
Right.
Instead of just focusing on yourself, you're directing it toward godliness.
Das
You're eating
Takta. Right.
Mayim. And Bittul Mitzias is more of a, let's call it more of a Yom Kippur experience where you're just feeling a very profound transcendent connection. I mean, I'm just giving an example of, so each of us has to find those two. I'm not saying that's your question. I'm just saying, if you want to speak in the personal terms, that's the two levels here, in general terms. But it's fine. Well, look, this topic is far from over. We're going to be discussing it plenty. Trust me, and there'll be ample time and to address every angle that we can.
Let me just say this much.
Okay.
There's my confusion is coming from the notion that in many occasions in the class, we say, look, how many of us could even talk about Bittul b'Metzius in a Siyah? On the one hand. On the other hand, we say, okay, davening Yom Kippur or Yechida can reach the highest level. So it's kind of like, well, which is it? And
the answer
we
is,
say
every time we've discussed it, I always said the same thing. B'chol moedecha is relative to each person. This is not absolutes. We're not running a marathon here in competition who's going to run fastest. Each of us has to find, relative to us, both levels. The level that's more Bittul HaYesh, the level that's more Yichud Allah. And with a good mashpia who knows your life and you want to share with your life, you can find it. If you can figure it out yourself, great. But I've given many, many examples for it. So each of us, the answer is that it's relative to you. It has nothing to do with an absolute level here. Everybody can experience a more Bittul HaYesh state and a deeper level of Bittul. That's why every day we say, B'chol levavcha, B'chol nafshecha, B'chol meidecha. Now, how many people actually think about the difference between with all their loving, with all their heart, with all their soul, with all their might? Yeah, most of the people daven lip service, to be honest. But if you really want to apply yourself, you could find the three. And I have given many examples, not here alone, but when we learned about this 20 pages ago, 50 pages ago, this has been a recurrent theme the three levels of Ava, Mamala Kalam, Sevav Kalam, and Etzem. So it comes down to finding relative to you. No one's asking you to be somebody else. That's an effort in futility. We don't have to be anyone else. We have to be ourselves. And in yourself, there are levels. I see it all the time. It could be children, it can be adults, it could be people who are high-level scholars and have been doing this all their life, and people who are just beginning to learn Chassidus and just beginning. So everyone has these levels. That's the bottom line. And you learn chapter 14 in Tanya, for example. He says that why we have the vow, the oath that we take to be a tzaddik and not a rasha. He says, because every person has to make an effort to be a tzaddik. Even if you can't become a tzaddik, it's still, the effort itself is an avodah and has effect. It's not a waste of time. It's an effort. And that's avodah. Avodah is effort, and each of us relative to our level. So you could legitimately ask, how can I find on my level these levels? That's an excellent question. So being that's a class with many of us here, I can't really sit and do it, customize it to each one of you. So that's why I advise either speak to your personal mashpia, or people speak to me as well. When time allowing, I can try to help. But a good objective person can just help you see it a little clearly. Or if you really apply yourself, apply to this, I think using a little of your mind, you can probably figure out some of these levels and then run it by someone just to make sure. But the point being is that all these levels can be accessed by everybody. Everyone here in this class, everyone, relative to our levels, and hopefully you climb. And today you reach it one way, and tomorrow Shema and Vahafta is a higher b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshcha, b'chol meidech.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, there's an interesting question. It's more rhetorical, but sort of I think what's driving this is the notion, well, many things, frankly. That's why it's hard for me to explain it. But one can delude oneself into thinking that they're accomplishing a bittul, and then you get a false sense of security, or that I've managed to transform myself in some way. But maybe that's just delusional. I'm still who I was before. I'm still going to make the same mistakes I was before. I'm still as grub as I was before. But I got a good head, so I think I have. How do you really know?
So listen, Chassidus talks about that as well. Dimyonis shav, when it's a dimyon, when it's not a dimyon, when it's an illusion, when it's not. Chassidim asked the Alter Rebbe this question. In Tanya, he talks about it. So that's why I keep mentioning mashpia, because it's easier to be a reality check if you have an objective friend who you trust, who can help you with that. Because sometimes you may think it's delusional, and maybe it is not so delusional. Maybe you don't see fundamental change, you don't see quick change. But who says? I've seen people who have changed, but it's slowly, and sometimes you don't even see it on yourself. So it goes both directions. Sometimes you could think you've gone farther than you actually have. Sometimes you think you've gone less than you actually have. I don't know if there's a rule. I think honesty and integrity is a key here. You want to be honest and have integrity and stand accountable. You're not looking to feel good about yourself only. You want to be honest and say, I want to. But listen, that sometimes we do want to feel good as well. So when we want to feel good, sometimes we can I don't say exaggerate, but we'll amplify a bit. I don't see that as a big crime either. As long as you are keeping yourself in check, you don't just become an arrogant. I don't mean you, I mean anyone. You don't become just an arrogant guy that just thinks, and that's it, complete delusions of grandeur. You keep on certain, like the Alter Rebbe says, to know how small you are and how great you can become. You keep a healthy balance between those two. I think it's because there's some people who beat themselves up much more than they should, and there's some people who inflate themselves more than they should. So this is called the balance that we have to find. Like the Frierdiker Rebbe says, just like we have to know our own faults, we have to also know our own strengths. That's where we have chaverim, we have friends, and we have mashpiyim, and we have people we can speak to. And we also have Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, time of introspection, where we can look in our hearts and try to be as honest as we can, and it has to be all b'simcha. Anything that starts demoralizing anybody, makes you feel like, oh, look how much I've tried and nothing's working. That usually is the Yetzer Hara too, wants to keep you down. It doesn't always tell you, it'll say, you think you've succeeded so much. Don't think you're so So there's a lot of voices in ourselves that are self-doubting voices, second-guessing, that undermine ourselves. And we have to also have a light spirit a bit about it, with a little a little lightness, a little simcha, that just keeps it also not getting too overwhelmed either way.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, very helpful. And I guess the reason I'm pushing this myself is because, first of all, I hope this is helpful for everyone in the class and people who are listening. I think it's relevant to everybody. But because we're in the Aseret Yimei Tshuva, and we're coming up on Yom Kippur, and we're all hopefully doing tshuva, trying to do tshuva, thinking about it at least. And then I find myself, I'm just using myself as an example. I'm not asking for personal advice or hashpah now. Bichlalo. I'm just saying to expand on what you're saying is in my davening. Let's say, for example, there are moments where I feel like I'm reaching to a higher level, and it's very moving, right? It's very emotional. Maybe even tears come out. And, you like to say tears bathe the soul. And I think it even says somewhere, you're not really doing proper tshuva unless there's some tears shed. You're not doing proper cheshbon and nefesh. That's on the one hand. It sounds like sounds like one's on the right path. On the other hand, one could be tearful because they're like, geez, look how little I've progressed, or look how wanton I am, how lacking I am. And then it's sort of really hard to tell what's going on here. Are you just, you're sad because you stink, or you're like really engaged in a process of tshuva? It's very confusing. And I think this relates to are you touching these levels? Are they untouchable? So I do think it's shayach to exactly what we're talking about. And on the inyan of, Davod Tzarech Gavoa, he does talk about tshuva. It's the example he gives about whether it's really happening, So anyways, that's where this is coming in. You said, express these issues in my own language. I was trying to do that.
Well, I'll just say a closing note here before I stop the recording. Keep in mind, very simple example. When you're learning something and something new, and it's over your head, you realize there's something here, but I don't really get it. And then there comes a point where you start getting it and slowly integrating it. It's a perfect example for avodah. There are going to be many things that are right now seem unreachable or very high level. But then at some point you start getting a little of it. And then that becomes more internalized. And then you climb the mountain and you see broader horizons. So anyone who's on this journey knows you're always going to have a combination of, I don't want to say the word frustration, but angst, or we call it tension and resolution. Rotze and shuv. The tension is when you feel lacking. You feel something, I'm not there yet. It's very healthy to have that, as long as it doesn't turn into anxiety and then demoralizing and disorienting and so on. And then there's the second half, which is integration, tension, resolution, where you internalize, you feel a certain peace you come to, that I've contained it, I've I don't say mastered it, but somewhat integrated it. And then the tension begins again to the next level. This is the normal process of a healthy growing person. And that's why it says tzaddikim, or sometimes talmidei chachamim, ein lehem menucha, lo ba'olam hazeh v'lo ba'olam haba. They do not have peace in this world, the world to come. Everyone thinks that's terrible, not to have peace. We're not talking about tension. We're not talking about anxiety and distress. We're talking about this healthy angst of knowing there's more and always wanting more. Any intelligent person knows that knowledge is exactly that. You never come to the end. You always know there's more, you climb more, and you have to constantly have this balance of climbing the ladder, seeing what's higher, integrating, and then climbing further. So it's naturally going to always have an element of certain moments of tension and some moments of resolution, or rotzi and shuv. And that is completely, to me, that's actually the sign of a healthy human being. If I see someone that's always resolved and they're always at peace, so where's the tension for more? And the angst, or the other way around, if a person only has angst, Then there's lack of integration. Look at the heartbeat, contraction, expansion. We inhale and exhale. Rotzei shuv. I saw it every day with the Rebbe. I saw it with great people. The great people were never at peace. They were at peace with the journey of not being at peace. Let's put it that way. But they were never just stagnating or just resolved. There was always what comes next.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Really like this saying, be at peace with the journey of not being at peace. I mean, that's a quotable. And I just hope for people listening, people in the class, that this was helpful. I found it very helpful, particularly during this period of Seres Mei Tshuva. And thank you for indulging this discussion. And to those who didn't appreciate it, I apologize. These issues were on my mind as we're learning this material. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful class. I really appreciate it.
I'll also mention that today is Vav Tishrei, 6th of Tishrei, the Rebbe's mother's yahrzeit, Tavshin Chaf Hei, in 1964. That would make it, what year is it? Okay, 51 years. Something like that, yeah. 49 years.
49.
Okay. So let me.
Did you forbring last night?
I didn't. Yesterday I gave a talk to Shluchim about Yechida. We'll probably post it. And I also spoke at the Koil today about the soul of Yom Kippur.
Oh, beautiful.
But did I forbring last night? No, I don't think so.
You spoke at a forbringing 2 days ago. It was in the afternoon. I don't know what that was about. I got it.
That
late.
was to the Shluchim about Yechida. You're right. It wasn't yesterday. It was what's today? Thursday. It was a Tuesday.
Yeah, it was Tuesday.
Right. It was Tuesday. Yeah. Tuesday I spoke. Last night, no, I didn't speak last night. But this morning at the Kolel, yeah.
But you might post the thing that you spoke about. You spoke to Shluchim about.
They will.
Yechida?
They'll post it as soon as it's ready. They're going to post it. Yeah.
Who's they? Your organization or whoever you spoke to?
My team.
And they'll post
we'll
it.
definitely post a link. I'm not sure. We'll see.
Okay. Thank you. Doing a lot of hard work these days, huh?
Yeah, a lot of work. Yeah.
It should only pay off and continue. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thanks, everybody.
I think he muted himself.
Yeah. All right. Everybody.
I muted myself.